several years ago. I was kind of a very shy and reserved trans person. I didn't really want to be open about it. But what I really discovered was that there was so much inequality then for trans people. I had a really, really great career, and I really couldn't find a job anywhere. It was very, very difficult for me to find a job, despite all those qualifications that you've heard, and having C-level positions in various companies like Universal Music Group and Hyundai Auto Canada. I really couldn't find a job, so I met Andrea when I started volunteering at the 519, and the reason I volunteered was simply because I needed something to do with my time, and I felt kind of unimportant or useless, and so it was really important for me to do something. And I just felt like I didn't want anyone else to have to go through what I went through, and if I was going to have any type of platform whatsoever, I was going to use it to try to help other people, especially kids who I didn't want to come up through the world and not be able to, find gainful employment or, to be productive members of our society. And much to my surprise, lots of people wanted to speak to me, and I was more than happy to speak to them about my experiences. So that's why it's important to me. In 1923, Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld coins the term transsexual. We don't really use the term transsexual anymore. There are some trans people who like that term better and still use it, but it's mostly, almost universally transgender now. But back in 1923, there wasn't really good language for gender diverse people. So he coined the term transsexual. It's really the first time it was used. 1952, Christine Jorgensen becomes the first American to receive gender reassignment surgery. It was big news then. She lived a really good and productive life after her transition, and really important figure in the trans community. There's an event in 1969 at the Stonewall Inn in New York City. I grew up in New York State. I was born exactly 1 week before this event happened. So I've kind of grown up around this whole environment of the Stonewall Inn in New York City. The Stonewall Inn, of course, back then, being a trans person or a gender diverse person was illegal. You could receive sentences of 3 to 30 years in prison if you were caught wearing clothes opposite of what your gender was on your birth certificate. And lots of people would, be prosecuted for those kinds of things. And so trans people and gay people and lesbians, everyone in the LGBT community, the only place where they really had to go to express themselves were at bars run by the mafia. And the Stonewall Inn was one of these places. And one night in 1969, the police came and raided it. They did this a lot in New York. They would come raid it. They would break it all up. People would leave. Someone would get tickets or arrested, and they would come back. Only this time, as they were taking someone out of the bar, she said, "Isn't somebody going to do something?" Trans women and gay men across the street started to throw dimes and nickels at the police. And the Christopher Street riots happened. They went on for 3 straight days. It's really the genesis of the whole entire Pride movement. So in 2019, there was a big deal around the 50th anniversary of Pride here in Toronto and all around the world. And that's really this event where it comes from. And it's really important to point out that trans women were a big part of that movement, and that Pride in itself was really formulated on trans women who were often forgotten in that kind of movement. So that's the reason I put it there. It's really important. In 1977, the New York Supreme Court ruled that Renee Richards could play tennis as a woman. She was assigned male at birth, and so she started playing tennis on women's teams. I put that there because it's important to point out that currently in the United States of America, there are 78 laws that are restricting the rights for trans people to play sports and get medical treatment. So this is not an uncommon tool of discrimination. It's been happening for decades. Women certainly have experienced this with Title IX. In 1988, there was a sports commentator, his name was Jimmy the Greek Snyder. He said that the only jobs for white people are going to be in coaching and sports because Black people were taking over. So this exclusion from sports is something that is a common thing to discriminate. Of course, lots and lots of female athletes are coming out and saying that trans women aren't their issue, that there's big other systemic issues. So really just important to know that. In 1999, I don't know if you've seen this flag before, but this is the transgender flag. It was created by Monica Helms, also a Navy veteran like me. And she made it because she didn't think that she made it in honor of her friend who was murdered, and also because there wasn't really a good representation of trans people in the Pride movement at the time. So this is our own flag. You'll see it on March 31st is the Trans Day of Visibility. You're going to see the trans flag a lot during Pride in June. And also the Trans Day of Remembrance is on November 20th, and I'm going to talk about that very shortly. In 2017, Canada passed Bill C-16. It added gender identity and gender expression to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It also provided special circumstances for crimes committed against trans people. We had this idea, I think, in the past where male on one side and female on the other, and what we're learning is that there's a spectrum of gender identity and gender expression. So that's why we use assigned sex at birth, because really the only marker is genitalia, and it's not a good marker, so that's why we use that. Cisgender is a term for people whose gender identity generally matches the gender assigned for their physical sex. So in other words, you could say it's someone who doesn't identify as transgender. It's derived from the Latin root cis, meaning on the side. But more so, I think, if you were assigned female at birth and you identify as a female, or you were assigned male at birth and you identify as a male, then you're a cisgender person. And that's what it really means. So when you hear people use the word cisgender, that's what they're referring to. Two-spirit is the next one. You see that in the LGBT2QS, 2S plus acronym. 2S means two-spirit. It's also two-spirit, or occasionally two-spirited. It's a modern pan-Indian umbrella term used by some Indigenous North Americans to describe Native people in their communities who fulfill a traditional third gender or other gender variant, ceremonial and social role in their cultures. And this is ancient. Third gender people in Native culture has been quite a position of reverence in tribal communities, and unfortunately, because of colonialism, that's changed over the past 100 years or so. So people are, trying to identify themselves if they're Indigenous people as being two-spirit, rather than say I'm transgender or genderqueer. The next one is genderqueer and non-binary. Those are people whose gender identity and expression falls outside the binary categories of men and women, or they may define it as wholly different from these terms. So they may identify as both men and women, or neither men nor women, or any kind of combination of those. When you look at pronouns, you have she, her, and hers, he, him, and them. There's also other groups of pronoun, they and them. They and them is a pronoun used by people who fit in this gender non-binary category. There's also a slew of other ones that you may have heard of that people use. I won't go through all of them here, but It's not just he and him, and she and her. Gender affirming is an adjective that's used to refer to behaviors or interventions that affirm a transgender person's gender identity. For example, the prescription of hormones for a transgender patient may be gender affirming, as well as the pronouns are gender affirming. So typically when people introduce themselves, they say, "Hi, my name is Rachel Clark. My pronouns are she and hers. This is a gender affirmation for me that my gender identity is recognized amongst people." Transgender is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity does not match the sex they were assigned at birth. So that's me. I'm a transgender person. Transgender people may identify as straight, gay, bisexual, or some other sexual orientation. I'm going to explain that in a minute. The common question I'm asked is, well, if you're transgender, how can you be with a female? I'm going to explain that to you in just a minute. But the word itself is derived from the Latin root trans, meaning across. So if we think about the Trans-Canada Highway, it's across Canada. Transgender means across gender, right? And then transition is a process in which transgender people move from living aligned with the sex they were assigned at birth to living aligned with their gender identity. So there's social transitioning, which is about presentation, relationships, and employment, and names and pronouns. Medical transition is hormone surgery, mental health, and legal transition is changing your gender marker, name on legal documents, and identification. And this is the most important thing of this whole presentation, is that each person's transition path is unique. So some people may choose to do none of those things, or all of those things, or some of those things. They may choose to have social transition, but no medical transition, and so on and so forth. So transition looks different to different people. And I will say that I think that transition is something that is a lifelong process. It's not just, you don't just start it and finish it and you're like, yay, I've transitioned, it's over. It's always a process of, getting through and, figuring things out and transitioning. And, there's always transition in our lives, and it's no less true for trans people. Well, you'll see it in different forms. You'll see LGBT, you may see LGBTQ2S, you may see LGBTQ2SAI, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You may see a big, long version of this. It's not to confuse people. It's to make sure that everyone is being included as an equal part of the LGBTQ2+ community. So when you see the extended acronym, I think it's 16 letters long or more, it's not trying to say, to confuse people who may not be familiar with the term. Basically, you could just think of it as one big community with lots of different identities. But in general, LGBTQ2+ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or sometimes questioning, and two-spirit, and others. So that's what the plus is for, right? There may be asexual. Asexual are people who don't have romantic lovemaking. It may be intersex, people who were born with either male or female genitalia together or none, or some idea of that. The first four letters of the acronym LGBT have been used since the 1990s. But in recent years, there's been an increased awareness of the need to be inclusive of other sexual identities to offer better representation. So as I said, the acronym's used to represent a diverse range of sexualities and gender identities, referring to anyone who is transgender and or same similar gender attracted. So sexual orientation, being gay or lesbian or bisexual, in the simplest form, is your physical attraction to one or more persons. So in my case, I have a female partner. I am a trans woman, therefore I am a lesbian identified person because I'm in a female-female relationship. My gender identity is my perceptions of having a particular gender, in my case, female, which may or may not, or which may not correspond to the gender I was assigned at birth. So there are straight trans people, there are transgender lesbians, there are gay transgender men, there are transgender people, have different identities across the LGBT or the LGBT spectrum. And because you're transgender doesn't exclude you from those identities. So that's why you may see trans people saying that they're lesbians or straight or gay. Your sexual orientation and your gender identity are different from one another. Okay. The use of the acronym is intended to be an all-encompassing way to recognize different gender identities and sexual orientations. The addition of other identities to the LGBT acronym also plays an important role in recognizing and connecting them to the larger community. It also means that individuals are able to gain greater recognition by society as a whole, rather than being erased or ignored or denied, which I don't think anybody wants to have happen to them. Acknowledgement can help foster greater visibility of marginalized identities. So that's why you always see other groups of people who identify as this, as a part of the LGBT community, want to see their identities expressed in an acronym. I will say you've also probably more recently than in the past, heard the word queer. A lot of people in the community refer to themselves as queer. It has been used as a slanderous term by straight cisgender people to marginalize the LGBT community, but I think there's been a huge movement to take that word back, and there's lots of people in the community who identify as queer. It kind of just encompasses everything, and sometimes I even identify myself as queer. So I would just be open to that idea. Oftentimes when I use that word, the question I get at the end is, well, I thought it's a slur. And I always say it depends on how you use it, right? If you're using it to, commit verbal violence towards somebody, then certainly it is a word you shouldn't use. But if you're using it in terms of being inclusive and, you're using it to self-identify yourself, I think there's a big effort to take it back. So that's that there. This is a pretty sobering slide I've put here. There's lots of barriers to the trans community. They often involve housing, healthcare, and employment. But there's also a lot of violence that is perpetrated against the trans community. I think from 2008 until 2021, there's been over 3,500 trans people murdered that we know about. And they're not being murdered as like a happenstance, or they're not being murdered, they're not counted in some other statistic. They're counted as trans murders because these are people who are specifically being killed because they're trans people. And it's a really large epidemic of violence that's going on around the world right now. And I wish that I could tell you that in 2021 that things have improved, but they actually, last year was the deadliest year for trans people ever. So, and part of that may be because reporting has improved, but also, we know that violence is happening towards trans people on an ever increasing size. So here's just some statistics around that. In 2020, 350 trans and gender diverse people were murdered. That's 6% more than 2019. And keep in mind, this happened because of during a pandemic, so even worse now. It's important to note that 98% of those murdered globally were trans women or trans feminine people. Trans men also get killed for being transgender, but most of the murders happen to trans women of color. 62% of murdered trans people whose occupation is known were sex workers. The reason that a lot of trans people choose to work in the sex trade is because there isn't a lot of employment opportunities for trans people. And, you know, the three big areas of discrimination, as I said, were employment, healthcare, and housing. And so when you're not able to get a place to live, and you're not able to get healthcare, and you're not able to get a job, sex work is a really viable alternative. The problem for trans people is it's dangerous, and it shouldn't be dangerous. Sex work, just from my point of view, is valid work. But unfortunately, you see the number here, it's bad. People of color make up 79% of the 28 trans people who are murdered in the US. Trans women of color are disproportionately targeted for murder all over the world. If you look in Europe, 11 trans people were murdered, but half of them were migrants. So people who are escaping situations like in Syria, Iran, or in Eastern Africa, coming to Europe, being killed just for being trans people. The worst of it is in Central and South America. 43% of this 350 number comes from Brazil. Brazil has a really huge systemic problem with keeping trans people safe. And, you know, there's been a lot of work done to try to improve upon that. Unfortunately, they have a leader, Jair Bolsonaro, down there who is making things worse. So there's a lot of systemic violence that's happening. And I will say that a lot of this violence is happening by the police in Brazil. So it's a really big problem. And it's also important for me, and I do this every time I talk about Brazil, the largest pride festival in the world is in Rio de Janeiro. So it's hard to watch, you know, a large pride festival happen in a place where more trans murders happen by far than any other place in the world. 38% of the murders took place on the street. That's pretty shocking to me, because it's often on the street in broad daylight and nobody does anything about it. They just let it happen. Even in the United States, even in Canada, it's happened. 22% in their own residence. The average age of those people murdered are 31 years old, and the youngest is 15 years old. So it's pretty important that we also recognize that this is the case, and the cause of it, you know, being employment discrimination and housing discrimination and healthcare discrimination. So you can be a big part of helping this situation. And I'm going to tell you how you can do that shortly. So why is this happening? I mean, progress has been made, but there's still lots of problematic issues. Media representation for trans people hasn't always been great, but even the positive media attention given to trans community isn't moving the needle. And the reason why that's happening is because when you see trans people on TV or you read about trans people, it's easy to just say, okay, the problem's solved and I don't have to deal with it. And I think that's a normal human response, but we have to somehow get over the fact that, you know, because we're seeing some more and more visible trans people, the problem is still as dire as ever, and it needs to have focus on it. There's also a lot of negative stereotypes reinforced about trans people being predators, and trans people are tricking other people. Trans women are women, trans men are men. Nobody is trying to trick anybody into believing anything else. So we're just living our gender identity. There's a lot of very powerful people out there like J.K. Rowling, who has written a book about a killer who was a man in a dress. And that was this year. So that narrative about trans people being predators is still very prevalent. And of course, that makes it easier to commit violence against trans people. And here's a quote I just like to read to you, because it's the most important thing to look at when in terms of trans inclusion. Groups targeted based on their identity, whether it's gender ideology or skin color, ethnicity, religion, or age, are often depicted as less than or criminal or even evil. The targeted group eventually falls out of the scope of who is naturally protected by our moral code. This is called moral exclusion and dehumanization at its core. When a group of people are dehumanized, it 100% of the time leads to genocide. If you see 3,550 people being slaughtered just because of their gender identity, that's a genocide of trans people, and it's an epidemic, and it's the reason why is because of this moral exclusion. So it's really important to recognize that. You should never out anyone. By outing somebody, I mean saying, hey, do you know Rachel? She's a trans person. Unless it's hard for me because I'm such a visible part of the trans community, but other people may not want you to let others know that they're trans identified. And so you should never, ever out someone, because doing it puts them at risk. I often say when we share pronouns with each other, I really encourage cisgender people to start that conversation rather than trans people doing it. The reason why is because if I walk into a room and I say my name is Rachel Clark and my pronouns are she and her, really what's happening is that I'm outing myself to you because I'm kind of visibly trans, and people, can confirm it just by me saying that. So when a cisgender person comes and says, hi, my name's Joanne and my pronouns are she and hers, her, then I don't have to feel like I'm the one that's initiating that conversation. So it's really important about pronouns. Here you can see ask about preferred pronouns. Some of you have your pronouns in your name. That's really great because that helps me to make sure that I'm not misgendering you. Know what's offensive. Some things that you should never ask trans people are what their name was before they transition, how much surgery they've had during transition. And there's probably some other questions too that are quite offensive, but those are usually the two big ones. What's your name before you transition? I've never ever told anybody that. There are some people, of course, who know, but I don't feel like I ever identified with that name, and I don't want it used, so I don't do it. It's called a dead name, by the way. You'll hear trans people say, don't use my dead name. That's my dead name. Having knowledge of what surgery or what transitional steps that trans people have taken is really not anyone's business. And it doesn't matter anyway. I'm not going to ask you what surgeries you had to confirm yourself as cisgender. So probably shouldn't ask me that same question. It's super offensive. Realize that support for you, for the trans community, may be uncomfortable. I think the best allies are the ones who are most uncomfortable about things, and if the work is not uncomfortable, it's not, we're not doing it right. So it's really great. It really should be uncomfortable and challenging for you. I have a friend who saw a trans woman getting harassed in a train. He was by himself. He stood up for her in the train against 4 or 5 other men, and that was super uncomfortable for him to do, but he did it, and he probably saved her life. So, realizing that even if it's uncomfortable, you may be saving somebody. Never make any assumptions about people and their identities or what they've gone through. Most important is to listen and actually hear what trans people are saying. Avoid dead naming. I just talked about that. And educate yourself.